History confirms it, but in many cases it does. I'm not going to replow that ground this morning. If you've not been with us, it has been recorded, and you can revisit that as you see fit. It's good to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity. In John 7:35, Jesus, in confrontation as he often was with religious leaders who didn't understand what he was saying, they said to one another, "Where does this man intend to go that we may find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?" Now, this is a Bible study hour, so maybe we can do a little bit of interaction here. Who wants to tell me, what in the world is the dispersion? It's Bible words right there in the gospel. What is that? Well, there's really no reason you should know that, even if you've read the Old Testament, because it's not there. It just, the idea is there, but it just pops up all of a sudden. So what we're going to do in this hour this morning, when we last met yesterday, we had looked at the arc of biblical history, the whole scope of it in the Old Testament, which is really bondage to bondage. It's Egyptian bondage to Assyrian and Babylonian bondage. The Israelite nation has finally achieved what God intended for it when he said, "I brought you out of captivity, out of bondage, so that I might dwell among you," and gives them the tabernacle, and then the tabernacle becomes a quote-unquote permanent form, more permanent, when the temple is built. And the ark and the presence of God are now on Mount Zion. But that doesn't last very long, and this permanent temple is eventually destroyed by the Babylonians in 586, and they're back in captivity. The northern tribes have been in captivity for 140 years before that. And so it is this arc of bondage to bondage, and we're going to try to pick up that story in just a few moments and carry it forward. I have to tell you that this is an impossible lesson to do, but we needed to put this in the stack when we're talking about the Bible and archaeology. This is actually, the last time I did this was a series of 5 days that I did at the University Heights Church in Lexington, right adjacent to the campus at UK, where, don't hold it against me, but I taught there for nearly 2 decades. And I couldn't do it in 5 days either, so I'm going to cram it all into 45 minutes, and we'll see how far it goes. But let's just start with what happened between the Testaments. And it's not just the dispersion, the diaspora, the scattering of the Jews out into the Greek Empire that we'll talk a little bit more today. But synagogues, we read about, for example, in Mark 1:9. I just put this together to walk through the Gospel of Mark, let's say. One of the earliest, probably the earliest to be written. What are synagogues? We don't read about them in the Old Testament, but they show up all over the place in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. Who are the scribes? Who are the publicans? The tax collectors. If you read through the Old Testament and read it many times, you wouldn't know anything about that. They just sort of show up in the New Testament. Herodians, Idumeans. Who were the Idumeans? Anybody know? It's a Greek form of a word that tells us that these were Edomites. These are the descendants of the cousins of Israel, the descendants of Esau. And the Herods, the whole Herodian family that we'll talk about, Herod the Great and then Herod Philip and Antipas and all of these guys who ruled and are scattered all over the Bible, all over the New Testament. So when we're reading the Bible and we encounter these names and ideas and people and places, and we don't know what they are, we have to go to this period between the Testaments to find that out. Who were the Zealots or the Canaanites, Simon the Zealot? What's the Decapolis, these 10 cities? So we're trying to explore what happened between the Testaments, and you can go on and up to that. What is this Aramaic term that's translated into Greek, and why are people not speaking Hebrew anymore, and what is Aramaic? And we can kind of figure out they're speaking Greek because they're in the Greek Empire, at least as it was taken over by the Romans. And so you get the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and the traditions of the elders and so forth. We have this reference, if you come over, and I'm pushing the wrong button again, but you come into John's Gospel, the temple built in 46 years. What? I thought they already had the second temple that was built, and they did. But when the people saw it who could remember what Solomon's temple looked like in their youth, even though what they remembered from their youth was a temple that had been marred and scarred and plundered, but they saw this little bitty replica almost of the Solomonic temple, and they wept. And then Herod comes along and rebuilds it to its glory, maybe even greater than Solomon's temple, architecturally speaking, but it is not a temple in which God ever dwelled. God was never in that Herodian temple, except when Jesus, walking on the earth as God in the flesh, was in the temple. And so we get back then to the dispersion and the rebuilding of the tabernacle, the temple itself, and so forth. If you get into Acts, you're still reading things that are not explained except with reference to this period between the Testament. What was a Sabbath day's journey? What were Hellenistic Jews who had a complaint against the Hebrews, the native population there? And what's a centurion? What is it to appeal to Caesar? What is this Roman citizenship business? So, let's go back into the Old Testament. And I want to make the point, I began with this incident from the life of Jesus because it is, after all, his life and teaching and ministry and miracles, and then his death and burial and resurrection to life again. That's why we're here. That's why we get up as Christians on Sunday morning and come together, come to a place where other Christians are, so that we may celebrate what the Lord has done for us. So we look at the Old Testament, and it's the Bible used by Jesus. It's 77% of the Bible, 59% of the books, if you just count them as books. And Paul tells us that it is profitable for doctrine and teaching and reproof and correction and training in righteousness. So we're trying to connect what's in the Old Testament with what's in the New. And what we've learned so far from the Old Testament, you probably know all this or knew all this already, but as I mentioned, the tribes are dispersed. The northern tribes are taken into captivity in 721. This is the time of Hezekiah and Isaiah. Then Assyria is taken down by an even bigger, meaner, faster dog, the Babylonians, 612 and 609, and a series of attacks against Jerusalem, which finally is destroyed in 586 or 587, depending on whose calendar you want to use. And then 70 years later, as Daniel, we'll be in Daniel in just a moment, as he learned from the book of Jeremiah, 70 years of captivity, whether you measure from 606, the first plundering of Jerusalem in which Daniel's taken captive, or 586, 20 years later, if you measure 606 to 516 or to 536 when the return begins, 70 years, or 586, total destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, burned to the ground by the Babylonians, to 516 when the temple is reconstructed, 70 years. So the roadmap of what we're going to do in the next few minutes is to talk about what we learned from Daniel about Babylonians and Persians and Greeks and Romans. We're going to advance the story from where we left it yesterday till we get to the New Testament time. We're going to talk about the diaspora, how Judaism was scattered among all these different nations. So they're not only in captivity, they are all over the place, sold into bondage. And we learn about Hasmoneans and Maccabeans and Herodians, Idumeans, Old Testament Edomites, now descended in the New Testament, and ironically, it's the Idumean family of the Herods who are now ruling the Jews. The cast-off descendants of Esau, who was not chosen according to God's sovereignty, that they are now ruling over according to the Roman Senate, they are now ruling over the Jews. And in Judaism itself, you get all of this sectarian, the different Essenes and Pharisees and Sadducees and so forth. We don't know about them in the Old Testament. That's something that arises here in the synagogues and the Sanhedrin. But let's come to Daniel chapter 9. We've looked at some of the other Old Testament prophets already. This is a text that was prompted by Daniel's reading of Jeremiah's prophecy that Israel would be in Babylon 70 years. He says, I was reading in the book of Jeremiah. So he's reading from Jeremiah 25. I won't take the time to go back. You can do that later. But chapter 29 also, he's reading this Old Testament book, and he discovered that the Lord had predicted this. Now, this is not this punishment. And again, you could go back to Exodus and Leviticus to read. God makes it very clear. He specified captivity in the foreign land as the ultimate penalty for the violation of the covenant. You keep the covenant, and these blessings will follow. You break the covenant, you violate your oath that you have agreed on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and some other instances as well, then this is what is going to happen to you. And so Daniel says in verse 11, as it is written, indeed all Israel has transgressed thy law and turned aside, not obeying thy voice. So the curse has been poured out on us, indeed, along with the oath which is written in the law of Moses that we just referenced, the servant of God, for we have sinned against us. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come upon us. We are in captivity because of what we read yesterday in 2 Kings chapter 17. We have not sought the favor of the Lord our God by turning from our iniquity and giving attention to your truth. And then he says, O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. Listen and take action for your own sake. Do not delay, because thy people and thy city are called by thy name. And so he's recalling this Leviticus text in which it is predicted that I will do this to you. And this same covenant also, if you read Leviticus, made provision for restoration. If, draw a circle around that condition, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I remember also my covenant with Isaac and with Abraham, and I will remember the land. And so we come to this period in which Daniel is interfacing with Nebuchadnezzar, who, as we pointed out yesterday, is discussed in nearly 100 passages, links 9 Old Testament books together, and makes the interesting and valuable point that God sometimes uses cruel or wicked rulers to accomplish his purpose. You can say that of Nebuchadnezzar, you can say that of Cyrus, you can say that of Saul, for that matter, or even of David sometimes. These people are not perfect, certainly, and it makes the point that whatever humans do, whatever their moral standing before God, God can still use them. So we come to Daniel 2, and Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream, and this is the dream, and you're probably familiar. It's one of the most famous parts of the book of Daniel. We will tell you the interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, or the power and the might and the glory, into whose hand it was given. In other words, God is using you, into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of heaven. You are the head of gold, in this figure that had the head and down to the legs and the feet of mixed clay. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise, and a third kingdom of bronze shall rule over all the earth, and there shall be a fourth kingdom strong as iron, and so forth. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another, but they will not hold together. And in the days of those kings, succession of kingdoms represented by this figure with different elements. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces and consume. It shall break in pieces and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw. And you can read the text with all of the gold head and the silver arms and chest and so forth and so on. And this gets us into this Persian period of Cyrus the Great. My servant is how he's described. The remnant of Israelites are coming back from captivity. Most of them have been carried away in captivity. Most of them were dead. They're killed in the capture. But many of them were taken into captivity, probably the ones who built all of these magnificent structures that we looked at archaeologically yesterday, built by slave labor. But we have a record in the Cyrus Cylinder. I've used some of what's in the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago, which I'm more familiar with, but this one's in the British Museum. And we read, for example, in 2 Chronicles 36, what is confirmed in some of the archaeological data. The first year of Cyrus, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Jeremiah has prayed this prophecy, prayed this prayer that's prophesied. And the Lord says to him, your prayer has been heard, and I have forgiven. So that the word of the mouth by the Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, who made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing, saying, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. So here's a biblical account that in some ways is confirmed, if you will, by what we know about Cyrus and Persian civilization and what's on the Cyrus cylinder. That doesn't prove that everything that's written in the Bible, that God answered prayer. It doesn't prove necessarily that God was bestowing his favor upon Cyrus. But it does indicate that whoever wrote the book of Daniel and whatever it says is well within what we know historically and archaeologically. And then you get this period where the temple is rebuilt ultimately. We know some of this. Not all of these artifacts are in museums, by the way. The Behistun stone, which is carved in the large carving in the side of a mountain, and which contains a number of different languages. Rawlinson was the guy who went up and kind of attached himself to the wall, and he's leaning out with a notebook or something on his arm, copying this down. But we learn from these inscriptions and the cylinders and other things that have survived about Xerxes, for example, Ahasuerus, when some of you came up in last summer and went through the Institute with me, which is how this series got started, actually. There's a foundation stone there of Xerxes. Jewish sources, including the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the scriptures, more about that later, and Josephus, who later records this history, identify him as Artaxerxes, and there was a big controversy about this, but inscriptional evidence leads modern scholars to conclude that, without a doubt, Ahasuerus was Xerxes, the son of Darius I. And so during this period, you get the end of the captivity, at least for some of them. There is a remnant that returned, really a remnant of a remnant of a remnant. A fragment of what was Israel went into captivity, and so a fragment was left. The 10 tribes are gone, 2 are left, then they're destroyed and most of them killed, but several thousands of them went into captivity, and a remnant of that remnant of the remnant comes back from captivity, and they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And then the succession of kingdoms continues, because Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedonia, for whom Philippi, the city, is named, he basically conquers the known world as they would have considered it in their day. Educated by Aristotle at age 13, marches eastward in 334 BC through the cities including Miletus and Ephesus and Sardis and Tarsus and Sidon and Tyre. Come back tonight, we'll talk more about some of those places, all the way down to Egypt, and then all the way over really to the Indus River. Controls this huge swath of territory that had been occupied by Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and Persians, and now is taken over by the Greeks, including the parts of Israel where he comes down and destroys a lot, but conquers a lot of other things. And then, like many of these empires, it's temporary. His empire, when he dies, is divided. Thrace and Bithynia go under Lysimachus. Egypt and Alexandria controlled by the Ptolemies, a dynasty that lasts for a good while. And then the Seleucids, or Seleucids, in Syria and Antioch, and then the territory that we know as Israel. So Alexander's empire forms the backdrop for this period between the Testaments that influences much of what we read about in the New Testament, particularly the Greek language, which becomes the lingua franca, the common language, kind of what English is today. In some ways, if you want to do business all over the world, I mean, English is the language of commerce and industry and air traffic control and software manuals, and if you still have manuals. But it's something that everybody speaks. If you want to do business, you need to speak English. And if you wanted to do business in the ancient world, in the world of Alexander's empire, you needed to be able to speak Greek. So to get back to our roadmap here, we're looking at how all of these developments between the Testament get us into the New Testament period. So let's talk a little bit about these Greek influences. Jews were influenced to various degrees. This is Jody Magnus's book on Masada that's on the reading list that I distributed yesterday. Under Alexander and his successors, Greek customs spread throughout the Near East, affecting all aspects of life, including language, religion, art and architecture, entertainment, education, governance, dress, food, etc. local elites, the leading citizens of a society, eagerly embraced Greek lifestyle and emulated the ruling class that knew that, particularly in Jerusalem, or maybe we should say even in Jerusalem, where Judaism is still probably at its strongest. Elite individuals, people who were wealthy, people who were leaders in the society, primarily wealthy priestly families, were not immune to these influences, despite the fact that the Greek way of life often contradicted biblical law and biblical customs. And so you get this Greek culture spreading all over the place, including not just in Israel, but in Egypt for a moment, where you get the Septuagint translation, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, because the Jews have been scattered all over the world. Over the generations, they have lost their ability, if they ever had it, to speak and read Hebrew. So they can't read their Bible. They're kind of like us in the sense that we can't read, most of us can't read the Bible in Hebrew or Greek. We don't read the languages in which it was written, in which the prophets spoke and the apostles wrote. So we use a translation. And that's what they had to do. They translated the scriptures, the translation of 70. The story is that there were 72 picked for the 12 tribes of Israel, and they translated the Hebrew scriptures, then parts of it in Aramaic, which was the language they learned to speak in captivity, into Greek. I would love to talk more about the Elephantine papyri, but we just simply do not have time to do that this morning. But influential in helping us understand how these Jews, this Jewish colony that was living, ironically back in Egypt. I mean, we say they're in Egypt and then sometimes it just flies right by us. They're living back where they came out of bondage. And even trying to rebuild, they did rebuild, not try to do it, they rebuilt a kind of the temple, which misses the point in some ways. I mean, it's an interesting attempt to use a pale shadow of your religion. You don't have a temple in Jerusalem. Well, let's build one in Egypt. Let me just stop to think about the irony of that for a moment. Because the temple is where God's presence is supposed to be, but God's not in this temple that's in Egypt. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about what happens now in Israel, where you get these pagan rulers steeped in their own traditions and in Greek culture, including this guy Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. I'll say more about that in a moment, but he follows Antiochus III, the Great. There's a play on words here with Antiochus IV. Antiochus Epiphanes, which means the brilliant one, but many people considered him Epimanes, a madman or a dullard, if you will. And we know about these people not only through documentation, particularly some of the books that are in if you have a Bible that has the Maccabees and Judith and Tobit and so forth, that's where you can read about this. Josephus also tells us a lot. But these people who are relating to Jewish culture but imposing a lot of these pagan practices and so forth, including equating Yahweh with Jupiter, putting up a statue of this pagan god. Antiochus erected one on the temple altar in Jerusalem now. Daniel speaks about the abomination of desolation. Jesus quotes that text in Matthew 24. The swine that they sacrifice, as unclean an animal as you can get, sacrificed on the altar. Heathen, pagan sexual rites are performed in the temple. There are drunken orgies, so you've got a temple of sorts, but it is being perverted by all of these Greek customs. Circumcision is forbidden to Jews under penalty of death. Sabbath observance and annual Jewish feasts are forbidden. So they're being controlled by all of these pagan rules, and copies of the scripture are burned. You can't read the Bible, whether in Greek or whatever language. Jewish high priest was replaced by a Hellenizer, Jason, and it's just a mess. So the flashpoint in this, in some ways, was that these pagan Syrians compelled an old priest, Mattathias, to offer pagan sacrifice. As a Jew, we're going to make you offer this pagan sacrifice. When he refused, another Jew volunteered to offer it. Mattathias killed him and the Syrian officer. He becomes a national hero. He is of the household of Asmoneus or Hasmoneus, and so you get this dynasty that develops. He has 5 sons. Judas Maccabeus, one of them, the Hammer, conducts this guerrilla warfare. They're in rebellion against the reigning powers, enters Jerusalem, cleanses the temple, removes the pagan idols, erects a new altar, and grinds to dust this Zeus statue that had been placed there by Antiochus. And this is where you get the Festival of Lights, now known as Hanukkah. 3 years after the desecration by Antiochus, these Hasidim, the pious Jews, emerge to cleanse Judaism from Hellenism, if you will, and produces what we know as the Pharisees, ignites all sorts of ideology about the Messiah. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole dynasty here. I want to come back to the roadmap so that we'll have time to conclude everything that we want to talk about. To go back to Daniel, we're trying to describe this diaspora Judaism with the Herodian family and all the sectarian Jews. I wanted to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I simply do not have time. That's just too complex a subject to unpack altogether. This is one of at the ISAC Institute in Chicago, we have one of the Dead Sea Scroll jars. Have I mentioned pottery before? Which, as you can see, actually is a better picture of that. As you can see, is cracked and broken, as many of the jars were, but you can put it back together if your pieces are big enough, if it's not been just smashed into smithereens like Jeremiah had done in Jeremiah 19. And so this has been put back together, and it could hold documents and protect them from the elements, perhaps. You also see the oil lamps that are there, and there's some other things. There's an ossuary behind that we'll talk about later. The Isaiah scroll, Dead Sea Scrolls found copies of fragments at least, of every Old Testament book except Esther, including at least two copies of the great Isaiah scroll displayed in Jerusalem and in a lot of museums. I mentioned the Louisville Museum yesterday. You can see one there as well. But these Idumeans, to go back to the Idumeans, embark on a policy of expansion. Let me back up just a second. I need to say one other thing about the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is this takes the copies, the history of the copies back 1,000 years. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered beginning in 1947, the earliest copies that we had were about 900 AD. So more than a millennium after the Old Testament is composed. Now we have copies of at least fragments of every Old Testament book, nearly complete copies of some, including a complete copy of the Isaiah scroll. And interestingly, there are very few discrepancies between, say, the Masoretic text, which came much later, and what we know now from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a whole history here. I know you did a series recently on how we got the Bible, and I'm sure you've heard all this before. But it comes out of this period between the Testaments that we're talking about. So let me do this. I need to get to Romans. Rome gained control of the eastern part of the empire about 146, following Punic Wars with Carthaginians. The Roman province of Asia Minor, which is why it is now called the Oriental Institute, was named because of Asia. Roman General Pompey annexes Syria in 64, and the Herods come to power. Antipater, the Idumean, supported Pompey, supported Julius Caesar. I think I've got the date wrong on that, but his son Herod was declared king of Judea by Antony and Octavian. And Herod the Great, at the consent of the Roman Senate, now begins to rule politically over Israel. So we come back to our text in Daniel. In the days of those kings, this period between the Testament develops, and it literally links the Old Testament with the New. So if I were going to ask what is the point of this, let's come to the New Testament now. Come over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6, and we get a similar idea in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. We're trying to link what's going on in the Old Testament with the bringing out of bondage and then returning to bondage with what's going on in the New Testament. And there are many object lessons to that. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, we get this statement about what's the significance of it. He says, whatever was written in the earlier times, what we read in the Old Testament, in other words, was written for our instruction, that through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. We might have the hope that the Israelites abandoned when they abandoned the covenant. The story of the Old Testament is God keeps His covenants. God keeps His promises. And when He says, if you do this, you will be destroyed, then you're going to be destroyed. If you do this, if you keep the covenant, you will be blessed. So the curses and the blessings of the covenant are kept almost without, well, certainly in God's case, without exception. Israelites didn't keep the covenant. And one of the main object lessons is this is what happens when you do that. And ultimately, the lesson is that God's prophecies are fulfilled, and ultimately, they are fulfilled by the Messiah in the New Testament. And so, maybe the question is, how much do we want to understand the New Testament? Let me go back for a minute because I skipped over a couple of things that I probably need to talk about a little bit more. Let me pause. Anybody have questions? I know we haven't had questions so far, but I'm happy to entertain some in a Bible class. So who's got questions about any of this? Yes? Okay. Outside voice, please.
Would the Maccabean books be considered historically accurate?
For the most part, yes. I mean, there are some places at which they might be challenged, but yes. And they are religious literature, so they're telling, like parts of the Bible are. I want to talk more about that a little bit later. But yes, as far as recording what happened to the Jewish people in this period, yeah, they're pretty reliable. I don't believe they're inspired. Now, some people consider them a part of the Bible. I don't accept that. But as historical documents, yes, they provide us a lot of good information about the Scripture. Is there a question behind the question, or does that?
No, sir. I'm just trying to make a connection between what we had in the Old Testament and what we have in the New Testament. That gap was whether or not what was written in the book of the Maccabees, I agree, probably not inspired writing, but was it historically accurate?
Yeah, I think the Maccabees and even First and Second Maccabees may be a little bit different from what's called Third and Fourth. Some of this literature, like Bel and the Dragon or Bel and the Snake, is pretty fanciful. So I wouldn't necessarily consider everything as accurate, but if you're reading the history of the Jews as it's described there, yes, I think for the most part it is pretty accurate. Anybody else? Boy, you want to chime in with anything with regard to this? I'm happy to listen to somebody else talk about this. We were talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I cut a lot out that I probably should have left in. The other thing that you see on this slide that I probably need to mention, because I may not have time to do it later, is this ossuary. An ossuary is a bone box, which was used commonly in this period of about 100 years either side of the lifetime of Jesus. And the idea was that when somebody died, they would put the body, not mummified, but treated with spices, as we read about in the New Testament. We put in a cave, and then after months or a year or so, as the soft tissue decays and you're left only with the ligaments and all that, you're left with a skeleton. A bone box is meant to accommodate the longest bone in the body, a femur, and then to put all of the other smaller bones in there, and you would put that in a little niche in the tomb, carved in the side of a cave often. And basically it's a space saver. And the one that you see here, which is of an individual who's pretty wealthy, this is the one that's in Chicago, In the next hour, I want to talk about the Caiaphas ossuary. And I mentioned Caiaphas, the high priest, who's the one who is at the trial of Jesus and so forth. And we actually have Caiaphas's ossuary. So there's a significance to that that I need to emphasize, and we'll come back to it in the next hour. I want us to get a sense that in the period between the Testaments, you get the development of a lot of this detail that's going on in diaspora Judaism, where you get all of these different sectarian groups that start to arise. The Pharisees maybe a little bit more interested in their version of the law. The Sadducees much more open to Hellenistic influences, to being sort of in bed with a lot of or compatible with a lot of the Greek influences that didn't necessarily match what the Jews had been done. They're producing their own copy of the scriptures so that everybody can read who speak Greek now. You don't have to speak Aramaic or read Hebrew or whatever in order to read the scripture. So if nothing else, just the production of the Septuagint by itself is significant with that. Synagogues were all over the place. There were something like 400 in Jerusalem just in the first century. And so a synagogue is a place where you might go as a kind of a Jewish family center, if you will, and particularly as you get outside of Jerusalem, they're important gathering places for Jewish families, for Jewish life to continue, not necessarily on the Sabbath day, but we get into the book of Acts and we see Paul and some other people frequently going into the synagogues. Jesus visited synagogues, particularly the one in Capernaum, which has been discovered, at least the foundation of a second century synagogue that was built on the site of the first century synagogue that without question Jesus was in according to the scripture. So I hope I've maybe captured a little bit of the idea of what's going on in this period between the Testaments. And I know we zipped through a lot of material, I hope somewhat effectively. Anybody else have questions? Yeah, Carrie?
Fair to say that Daniel 11 hosted those kingdoms that came from Alexander the Great? Because it's very confusing to try to read about the kingdom of the northern kingdoms and so on, but those are the kingdoms, right?
Well, I think so, but of course there's a lot in Daniel that is subject to varying interpretations, and But yeah, I think basically that's correct. Yeah. Is there a question behind the question, or?
No, I just always wondered about that and trying to make that connection to all of that, the breakup of Alexander's.
Yeah, and there's a question even about the sequence of Daniel and what occurs when and in what order, and then of course you get to the horn, if you will. That's controversial, and I don't have the answers to a lot of those questions, but I think it's good to consider it. Another question, I saw a hand back here, I thought. No? Well, I'm done for this hour, and we want to come into the New Testament period next time. I probably should just say again that the value of what we're talking about is not necessarily to prove the scripture is true. The Bible makes religious claims in addition to the historical information that it has that can't always be demonstrated. There's no way to demonstrate some of the miraculous spiritual claims. We began with this text in Luke chapter 5 on Friday night, where Jesus says, in order that you may know that the Son of Man has power on the earth to forgive sins, which is something you can't see or test, I'm going to give you something that is testable, that's empirical, and that you could prove or disprove. You could falsify it if you wanted. And that is, rise and take up your bed and walk. If you say that, there's a test for that. If you say, I can forgive sins, nobody really knows the answer to that. So to accept by faith that Jesus has the power to forgive sins, I will show you something that that you can get your teeth into empirically and logically speaking. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate the kind attention this morning. And do we have a closing prayer at this hour, or we just stand at ease for a few minutes? Thank you.